Thank you all for coming today. This class, it's very impressive, the turnout the Sunday right after Thanksgiving. Today we talk about Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, the rich man and Lazarus. Aaron?
And so as we do each week, before we open our text together and learn, we'll begin with the blessing of study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the source of life in the universe, who has commanded us with many obligations, among them immersing ourselves in texts of meaning. Amen.
This parable, Aaron and I have been talking about this a lot over the last week or so, could be a whole semester. So just know that. We're going to touch on a few things today, some of the landmarks and the landmines, as well as talking about a bird's eye view before we get into it. This is one more than other discussions we've had that we certainly invite your input, your response, your questions, your thoughts, and so on. Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. And by the way, do you know what happens, what's said right before and right after this? What's context for this gospel reading? Does it just drop out of the sky straight from heaven to all of us? This is Jesus talking, in this case, to a group of Pharisees. And the Pharisees have been grumbling and making fun of him. And this is an ongoing dispute between the two of them. And so Jesus tells this story. So it's to Pharisees, to the disciples, to the crowds, to all sorts of people there. And before we even get into a couple other subjects, Jesus is Jewish, the Pharisees are Jewish, the disciples, the crowds, and even the gospel writer Luke are all Jewish. This is an internal discussion. I'm going to add a couple. There's a better translation of this, but I'll read this one with some additions. There was a certain rich man who dressed in purple. Thank you, Sarah, for dressing in purple today. There was a certain rich man who dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. At his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, there is a great chasm that has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so. No one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." So this would be, after he finishes the story, we would call this a mic drop moment. So the Pharisees harassing them, Jesus tells this story and silences them. We would say that, but less politely, he shuts them up. Let me say, too, I wouldn't draw a big theology of the afterlife from this story. This is not what heaven and hell, Sheol, Hades, that's not what this is really about. It's about values, and what are most parables about? You remember what we keep saying over and over? The kingdom of God. They're about what it means to live when you follow all the commandments, what it means to have the Messianic age, what it means when we embody how God has called us to live in covenant relationship. And so parable is a story that provokes, it prods, it elicits, it demands a response, a change of behavior, usually. Now, this story that Jesus told is not original. There are lots of folktale versions of this all throughout the cultures of the Middle East. There's a rich man and a poor man, and they both die, and then what happens? That's a pretty stock story. What is different about this one is usually the rich man has a chance at redemption, to have a do-over, one more opportunity. What came to mind immediately was Dickens' A Christmas Carol. You're the rich miser, lonely person, and then you have this dream on Christmas Eve, and you have visited by ghosts from Christmas past, present, and future, and then he wakes up and changes his ways and buys a Christmas dinner and gives the guy a raise and takes care of Tiny Tim, and he's a changed man. In this story, what happens to the rich man? He stays in hell. That's what he does. It's all over, no chance at redemption. By the way, I read this yesterday, that the ghost in chains, that was inspired by Dickens' visit to Pittsburgh. I don't know how I feel about that, but kind of proud to the Western Penitentiary. So in the story, that guy in the dream, he wakes up and changes. Is this story factual? Did it happen? No. Is it true? Does it reveal meaning, depth? Does it point to something that we can learn or learn in a deeper or new way? I would say yes. Now here's a question for you. Does it matter if this story appears in the Bible? That gives it a certain level of clout, of veracity, of authority. What if you here had a dream and you dreamed that story? Would that make it more or less true? What if you read about it in literature? You might be more aware of it, but see, this story operates at various levels there. You want to jump in?
Sure.
I'm almost to...
I was once, just to echo what Jonathan is suggesting, I was once asked, it was on an Israel trip with teenagers. We're on a hike somewhere, and these kinds of spontaneous conversations take place. And one of the teenagers asked me if the stories in the Bible are true, which is essentially the question that was just posed here. And in talking about it, we arrived at the idea that they're true not because they took place, but because they happen again and again and again, which is a nice way of distinguishing, I think, between something that's factual or historical versus something that's true because it's got a mythic truth. There's a plumb line that runs through human experience because we see it replayed again and again, the dynamics within families or between generations or between rich and poor and the like. So the truth is embedded in the universal experience in the story. That's all I was saying.
Thank you. Do you see from the context and from the content how this particular parable has been used for what is usually called anti-Semitic purposes? Did you catch that? Told in response to the Pharisees, all those Pharisees. We even say something is pharisaical, and that's not good. You don't walk the walk, you just talk the talk. You don't have consistency, integrity. You're really a hypocrite. It's almost a synonym. It was told to the Pharisees, and you notice a little line towards the end? They won't even listen if somebody comes back from the dead. Obviously a reference to Jesus. Those terrible Jews didn't get it, so let's slam them again. This has been used over and over, but I think that completely misses the point of what this story is saying. Think of this story rather than as a club, think of it as a key. Not to beat somebody over the head, you terrible Pharisees, you're all awful people, thank God I'm better than you, which immediately turns you into the worst stereotype of a Pharisee. And remember, in the Bible, these are not fully developed characters. They tend to be like the rich man and Lazarus. They tend to be caricatures, a stereotype. but there's some value to that. A stock man, a stock woman. It's a key rather than a club. Now, the story is not to promote Pharisee bashing, but let me get a little Jesus-like and make you uncomfortable, which I think is what he did extremely well all the time. So it's easy, yeah, we shouldn't bash the Pharisees, that's terrible. But who's your favorite Pharisee today? What group is your favorite person that you are morally superior to, that you like to judge, that you like to condemn? That is, who is currently to blame for all the problems of the world or the problems that bother you? Think for a moment how much in our society, particularly today, more than 10 years ago, maybe I'm the only one that feels this way, everybody's to blame and things are really, really divided, that we tend to look out for responsibility rather than take responsibility for ourselves. Just last week, Jeff Myers, the rabbi, said, some have blamed, I don't think this is lots, but some have blamed the Jews for the COVID pandemic, or at least the Jews got rich off of it. That's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Here's the problems of the world. It's all the illegal aliens and those who encourage it. It's the heartless people who mistreat migrants. It's all the oppressive people responsible for all the isms, racism and sexism and homophobia and all the rest who pretty much ruined everything. I've heard this. It's all those crazy people who forced lockdowns and vaccine mandates and ruined the economy and banished our children from schools. It's all those who refuse to wear a mask or get vaccinated, or can't they follow the science, or why do they only care about themselves? Both of those last two, of course, are threats to our democracy, or so we're told. Why do we look out? Well, I don't know where he's going with this, but I'm not sure I like it. Perfect. So who's your favorite Pharisee group to blame? Everybody has one. Pharisees are the ones who always think they're right, but to do so it's very easy to go back to that. It misses the point of what Jesus is saying. It misses the point of what Moses and the prophets are saying as well. That we are all, my brothers and sisters, however you identify, a potential Pharisee. Don't forget that. The story is for you. Not me and Aaron, because we're perfect, of course, but all of you Pharisees out there. So Jesus is not encouraging us to abandon the faith, not to abandon the law and the prophets, but to inhabit them, to live into them, to embody the commandments of Israel. So they had just criticized Jesus, and then he lays this parable on them. Yeah. Tell the slightly inappropriate story about the bicycles.
Yeah, okay, hang on.
If you want to blame the Jews, remember this story to pull out when you need it.
I was reminded as we were speaking about this aspect of the parable, or our desire to share this with you, of a joke. I don't know that it's very funny, but the idea was that on the streets of Berlin during the Holocaust, at a certain point, a Nazi officer pulled a Jew out of the crowd and began to berate him and insisted to know who's responsible for all of Germany's problems. And the Jew understands that the answer is the Jews, so he responds, the Jews and the bicycle riders. And the Nazi official says, why the bicycle riders? He responds, why the Jews? Let me add a couple other points there so that I don't leave you just with that. And that is, I have a book on my shelf that's called You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. And there's a lot about that as sort of a plumb line in the work that Jonathon and I are sharing and the experience that we're having. It would be easy to read this parable, probably too easy to set it up simply as us and them, or the good guys and the Pharisees, or those of us who are in the know and the Jews who won't accept the truth. But I think the truer approach is to understand that another doesn't need to be wrong for you to be right, for me to be right. The second, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg encourages us to appreciate that it's rather easy and convenient and comfortable for us to describe what we appreciate about our own group, whatever that may be, religion, politics, your family versus my family, doesn't matter. It's easy to say what we like and appreciate and value in our own group, and easy to recognize or deride and dismiss the problems in the other group, but our challenge, if we're going to live with each other, is to appreciate the ways in which our own thoughts or our own group fall short of our ideal, and the ways in which we appreciate or recognize or admire that which the other polity or the other group possesses. That there's truth in both of those, that no one has a lock or a monopoly on all of the good qualities, and the other group can't be easily painted in dark colors. And finally, the theologian G.K. Chesterton, 19th century British theologian, no friend of the Jews, when asked what the biggest problem with religion is, famously responded, "I am." And I think that's something worth remembering also. Okay.
That was good. Thank you. A couple other high-level things before we get all the way into the story. Certain rich man and Lazarus. Wealth is a theme throughout this, but what is, in this story, the context of this parable, what is wealth a metaphor for? What does it represent? Is it just money, or does it mean more than that? Privilege, power. I still didn't understand. I'm sorry. Okay. What other? Abusive power, wealth, privilege, power, influence, security, prestige, leverage. You can get all these things. This guy had it. The other one, the poor man, did not. Here's a question to think of, because remember, all these are about living in the kingdom. So how we think of wealth, power, prestige, influence, leverage, and the rest of it influences how we live out our faith as a Jew, as a Christian, as whatever. What is money to you? How do you think of that? Is it something that belongs to you? Something you use? Something that uses you? Have you thought about that very much? What is money? What is wealth? What is power? Security, yes, it's all those things. How is money, wealth, power best used to live into the kingdom of God? That's the question that Jesus is encouraging us to ask. Does that mean you can't have your own house or eat good meals? No. There are rich people in the Bible that are good guys, good women. They're not all bad. It's not the issue of having money or not. And of course, we're speaking relative. We're richer today than all the kings that we're talking about, most of the kings in the Bible here. But how we use it is what matters. Is money something you have, or is money, wealth, something you hold in trust? That, I think, is the key distinction about living in the kingdom of God. What does it mean to hold something in trust? You hold it for the benefit of others. It goes to God?
No, and those to come.
And those to come. So it's not mine. I can tell you, one of the most powerful images to me of all of Calvary Church is the names of the 16 rectors that are carved in stone on the west wall just between the narthex and the church. And my first name is spelled a little funny. It's O-N rather than A-N at the first name. And I was asked like 10 times, what's the spelling of your name again? I was like, it's not that big a deal. Just whatever you call me is fine. And then I got here and saw my name carved in stone, and it had a really deep effect on me. I had the same feeling yesterday. When do you have your name most likely carved in stone? When you're dead. So thank you for coming here, and I had this immediate reminder of my mortality, first thing. But what it really meant was this sense of permanence. I know it's not forever, but it's long-lasting. And there is my name carved in stone. And then there are two other really important points. Seeing the name carved with all 15 people before me, Harold Lewis, Arthur McNulty, John Bays, Sam Shoemaker, all the way back to the beginning, I'm in this line and have this sacred, I call it a sacred trust. I don't own Calvary at all, of course, but I have this responsibility to take care of it and to try to make it better, to preserve it, to share it, to keep the idea of Calvary alive. That is what it means, at least to me, to hold something in trust. And so it's not for my greater glory and power, but that's my call while I'm here. The other great piece of that reminds me constantly when I walk back there, you see 16 names carved in stone, and then there are about 7 places after my name that are blank. It's a symbol that this church has a future, that we expect to be here, and that sacred trust and responsibility has to be passed down. And who will come after me? Man, woman, black, white, brown, it doesn't matter. What matters is that person will take on that same sacred trust because everybody before has. That's a different way to think about certainly being a priest and a rector, but that's how thinking in the kingdom works. Now, am I perfect at that? Heck no. Ask anybody here if you're a visitor, but that's what I'm trying to do. Think about if you viewed your money, your health, job, vocation, career, everything as a sacred trust, how would your life be different? That's what it means to live in the kingdom. Now, why were the Pharisees, why did they continually harass Jesus? Probably a few reasons. Threat to their power. He was interpreting the Bible differently. They didn't like what he had to say because they could take from the Bible. Now, is this a perfect reading? I don't think so. Could you, Aaron, make a case that having money is a sign of God's favor?
So the answer is yes. In Deuteronomy, we are introduced to a theology that goes by the name Deuteronomistic theology, with which you're familiar, if not by name, then just sort of in the way we like to think the world works, which is to say that if you follow my commandments, Deuteronomy teaches, then you'll get rain in its seasons and you'll have a bevy of crops. And if you don't follow my rules and my commandments, then bad things and curses will follow you, which is to say you get your just deserts. And therefore, in such a world or such a theological system, those who have wealth are enjoying God's favor, and those who are without have gotten what they deserve likewise. It can be a very dangerous kind of theology if you believe that everyone gets what they deserve. And so if you get a bad diagnosis, or if you have a reversal of fortune, or if you have this circumstance into which you're born, well, that's what you deserve. And likewise, if you're fortunate and wealthy and what have you, then that's obviously a sign that God has blessed you. That's a theology out of Deuteronomy that the Pharisees are described as holding fast to, and Jesus is introducing a new notion, right? That with wealth comes responsibility. That with wealth there are other virtues that are expected of you, and when you don't live up to that, well, then you've misused the good fortune that God has granted you.
Yeah, it's easy to blame poor people for their own problems, or sick people, or those with any problem at all. You have deserved it. Have you ever heard anyone say when something really bad happens, what did I do to deserve this? Yeah, this theology, philosophy, way of thinking is extraordinarily contemporary. In fact, a lot of people, if you ask them if they have any theological belief, it's probably not a very nuanced thing about grace and faith or being in a covenant relationship. Am I a good enough person to go to heaven? Am I good? Am I not a good person? That has almost nothing to do with the idea of grace through faith, at least in Christianity. But I would say most Americans have some version of that. Do you want to tell what's the negative, the Panera story, the negative of, it's called prosperity gospel. Have you heard that? That's a little insidious version of it in America. If you're faithful and do the right things, primarily if you buy your rector a Rolex watch and a new Mercedes. I'm not denying it. I'm just saying it's called prosperity gospel. You will be blessed. Claim your blessing. It's usually how you say it. You've got to live into that. You've got to want it. And if you act good enough, God will bless you richly, because it says right there in the Bible, you'll get rain and so on.
So I tell this story. This a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, I was at the Panera at Bakery Square for a morning meeting, and I was at the beverage dispenser, getting some ice and some drink, and a woman walks up to me. She has sort of brassy hair and a fluorescent vest. She's a traffic guard or a sort of a patrol for school buses and the like. So she was very colorful, and she says, "Good morning, how are you?" And I said, "Good, I'm fine, thank you. Good morning, how are you?" And she said, "I'm blessed, and I know you are too." I was sort of shocked. I said, "You're right. You're right. I am, thank you. That's a good way to start the day." And I went to my meeting and thought about it, then shared this story in a number of different places about the theology I had discovered at Panera's, and how, it sort of shook me up, and you can find it anywhere. I thought I was doing really well with this story. And then someone pulled me aside and explained to me that this feeds into the prosperity gospel, and the underbelly of that is that if you're not blessed, or you don't perceive that you're blessed, or you don't have good fortune, then you've deserved it. Right? We spoke a little bit about that. And so sometimes this kind of theology can be weaponized, either to insulate the person who has done well financially or what have you in life, and to dismiss or disparage or to step over the person who fortune has not favored. So this plumb line about what to do about money. I remember when I was a Hillel director at the University of Virginia, right out of rabbinical school, there was a taxi cab company in Charlottesville that had these wonderful aphorisms stenciled out with the letters that you would put on your mailbox to spell your last name. They stenciled out these aphorisms on the back of these Oldsmobile taxi cabs. And the one I remember said, there's no shame in being poor, it's just inconvenient. I think it's more than just inconvenient, right? But what money means to you, to your family, whether or not you understand it to be that to which you've entitled, or that which you've worked hard, or whether you do hold it in trust, whether that comes with responsibilities, obligations, expectations, all of those things are wrapped up in that. In the Talmudic collection of wisdom teachings, the rabbis ask, Mi Ashir, which is to say, who is wealthy? And their answer, their counterintuitive answer, is the one who is content with what they have. And we all know folks, right, who have an enormous amount of financial wherewithal and resources, but feel themselves lacking in some respect because someone else has something that's larger or bigger, or they don't feel fulfilled in that way. We know others among us, perhaps, who feel that we have very little in actual means by which we can measure in a bank book, but feel ourselves very blessed, or know that we have our health or our family or what have you. So the sense of contentment is one of the Jewish definitions of wealth. That and the ability to meet our own needs, coupled with the subjective sense that we have more than we require, and then feeling the impulse to share that in whatever way may be appropriate.
Thank you. So, Clint?
It seems to me we haven't reached an important part in the parable, which is that we should listen to Moses and the prophets. That's what the man who's in hell says he wants them to reach his 5 brothers. The important thing is Moses and the prophets. Maybe he was almost more important than the afterlife, the resurrection.
We're talking about the important thing in the story is to listen to Moses and the prophets. Yes, we'll get to that here in 12, 15 minutes. Jesus is telling this story, in one sense, to obliterate the notion of this Deuteronomistic, that's a hard word to say, way of thinking. The contemporary view of how we view good and evil, what it means to be a good person. Just because you have money doesn't mean that you're a good person. Just because you're poor or sick or disabled or whatever means you're a bad person. It has nothing to do with that. This, remember, is about living in the kingdom. So this certain rich man, is how the Greek reads, could be anybody, was dressed in purple and fine linen. Purple was, why does that matter? It's a sign of royalty. It's expensive. And fine linen is fine linen. It's very nice, even to today. That's how he was covered. How was Lazarus covered? In sores. Ooh, gross. From the first line, wow, I'd like to be around the rich guy. He's probably also clean. He has enough money to bathe, have people take care of him, versus that nasty old guy. At his gate, and he feasted sumptuously every day. Not just at feasts, not on Thanksgiving and holidays. Every day he had the finest things. So he lived off of everybody else taking all this. And at his poor gate, and in the Greek it says, a poor man was laid at his gates. Lazarus didn't have agency to go there on his own. Somebody dumped him there, dropped him off at the gate, and drove away. When I won't say the town, yeah, I will. In Lawrence, Kansas, I was there for 7 years. It was a regular occurrence to see a Topeka people, police car come up and drop a person off downtown, usually right next to our church, and drive back to Topeka. There's your problem. We don't have to deal with them, because all you crazy lib college town people in Kansas, Lawrence, will take care of them. Every week that happened. Somebody laid Lazarus at the gates, meaning, not my problem, here, it's your problem, you can keep him. And what does a gate do? Lets you in or keeps you out? Which side of the gate is Lazarus on? The outside. The outside of the gate. Lazarus, notice he gets a name. He's the only character in all the parables, everyone in the Bible, to get a name. Lazarus comes from Eliezer, which means in Hebrew,
God will help.
God will help. You had a question, Russ?
There's a paradox in here that I just realized. It must have been known at some level to Jesus and his Pharisees.
Let me start over, if you would.
So the paradox in this story is that Abraham here is presented as the divine judge. That in the next world, he assigns some people to good life and others, like Lazarus, get what they deserve. In the book of Genesis, Abraham dies a very wealthy man. In fact, he's wealthy at least halfway through the story, and that's, there's no commentary on that. He doesn't give his money away to the poor or do any of those things. Nobody seems to notice that in this story.
That's fascinating. I was struck by the reference to Abraham being at heaven, sort of playing the role that at least in colloquial jokes we get assigned to St. Peter, being the one who's at the gate deciding who comes in or out, right? And in doing my own little research on it, there was a theological problem, that is to say that the saints, using that term loosely, from the Old Testament, the patriarchs, the matriarchs, Moses, never mind Abraham, don't have a way of making it into heaven in Christian theology sans the presence of Jesus or the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so they have to sort of hang out in waiting for a while. In Genesis doesn't know anything about an afterlife. So when they die with whatever they had, and their story is, and maybe they were wealthy. There's no virtue or disrepute in being wealthy in and of itself. It's sort of like the line from Hamlet, where he says, there's nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Money in and of itself isn't good or bad, it's what we do with it. In the same way it's true with our bodies or any other opportunity or resource that we have. But it is a nice juxtaposition. We have wealthy Abraham deciding whether or not this other wealthy fellow were not merits.
Why would Abraham be the one in the story in that role? Is that random? Who's Abraham?
He's considered the first Jew or the first monotheist or the one with whom God has an initial relationship. Yeah?
So the authority, if you will. If anybody's going to make up the mind about who gets in or what happens, Abraham's the guy that we look to.
The other piece I would say, let me give you sort of a Jewish gloss and with a parallel text that I think will be helpful for us. The first is that as the story begins, we have this image of Lazarus at the gate, which for me was an echo of a text I want to share with you, which I believe would have been a story that would have been familiar enough, not unlike the idea of the death of a rich man and a poor man, were part of an older trope of tales. The second is the presence of Abraham, Father Abraham, sort of giving his imprimatur to what's going on, the older Jewish patriarchs doing that. And then at the very end of the story, which we're going to come back to when I share with you this second text, we have the idea that the Jews have have Moses and the prophets, which is the Torah and the books of the Hebrew prophets, and even someone coming back from the dead won't convince them otherwise. Here's the text that I want to share with you. I made 50 copies, so if you'll help me, we'll sort of send them around. It's considered the case that while Lazarus in this story is not to be confused with the other character named Lazarus in the New Testament, who is raised from the dead, for the reader who's familiar with the omniscient reader, who's familiar with that other story, we can't help but link the two, even if we disabuse ourselves of the idea that it's the same individual. So the fact that of all the characters in all the parables, this character is the one who gets a name, and precisely his name is that of another character who we identify with being raised from the dead, right, the story of Lazarus, is itself curious. But for me, I wanted to share with you a text that comes from the Babylonian Talmud that describes a character. I have his biography on the back, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, about whom you can read. He's from the early 3rd century. I don't know exactly how that tracks with when Luke was written. But he's described, you'll see at the very end of that little biographical piece, that he's described these fanciful stories about dialoguing with the prophet Elijah. And Elijah himself is considered the prophet. We welcome Elijah at the Passover Seder at his conclusion. He's the one who will herald the coming of the Messiah. So Elijah is a very interesting character in Jewish tradition. Here's the story. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi met Elijah standing at the entrance of Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai's tomb. We can forget who these individuals are for a moment. He asked him, "Have I portion in the world to come?" He replied, Elijah did, "If this master desires it." Rabbi Joshua ben Levi said, "I saw two, but heard the voice of a third." That is to say, he's speaking with Elijah, and yet he hears another voice, right? He and Elijah are speaking. Those are the two, and yet he hears a third voice. He then asked, "When will the Messiah come?" "Go and ask him yourself," Elijah replies. "Where is he sitting?" And the answer is at the entrance. And different texts have at the entrance of the city or at the entrance of Rome, at the gates of the city. "And by what sign may I recognize him?" "He is sitting among the poor lepers. All of them untie their bandages all at once and rebandage them together, whereas the Messiah unties and rebandages each of his wounds separately before treating the next, thinking, should I be wanted, it being time for my appearance as the Messiah, I must not be delayed through having to bandage a number of sores, yet rebandaged." So the Messiah is to be found among the lepers, among the beggars, the destitute, that are entered the city, and you'll distinguish the Messiah among all the other lepers because he alone is uncovering his bandages and rewrapping them one at a time as opposed to removing all of his dressings at once. So Rabbi Joshua went to him and greeted him. He found this individual saying, "Peace upon thee, master and teacher." "Peace upon thee, O son of Levi," he replied. That's what Ben Levi means in his name, son of Levi. "When wilt thou come, master?" he asked of the Messiah, and he answered, "Today." On his return to Elijah, the latter inquired, "What did he say?" He said, "We exchanged these pleasantries. Peace upon thee, O son of Levi." Thereupon, Elijah observed, "He thereby assured thee and thy father of a portion in the world to come." And then Joshua says, "He spoke falsely to me, stating that he would come today, but he has not." And Elijah answered, "No, this is what he said to thee. I'll come today if you will hear my voice," or if you will hearken to God, is conditional. Now, it's fascinating, this text to me, juxtaposed with the parable, because if we're to understand that this beggar or this destitute individual who doesn't have the strength to place himself at the gate, but he's delivered there. Do you remember the movie My Left Foot? And you may have found in that movie the meaning of the word basket case. Someone who can't carry themselves around was basically put in a wheelbarrow. He was put in a basket and taken from place to place and essentially deposited wherever it was that he was going to go next, this person that was a basket case. That's essentially what Lazarus is in this story. And yet there's an echo from Jewish tradition that suggests that such an individual is themselves the Messiah. Now, if that's the case, whether or not Lazarus is the Messiah or Lazarus who's being asked by the rich man or asked of Abraham that he be sent Lazarus as if he's come back from the dead, echoing the other Lazarus, foreshadowing what is going to happen for Jesus, or what already did happen, it wasn't recognized. We're now inside this very interesting world. And so, over and above discussing or unpacking these two texts, we want to invite us, how would we be different? How would we move in the world differently? What would a day for us be different? In what ways would a day be different were we to allow that the next person we see, or the most uncomfortable person we see, or the most dispossessed, or the lost of those whom we see is themselves either the Messiah or God, or God.
Yeah, thank you. Part of what I think Jesus is saying, what it means to live in the kingdom, is to expect the next person you meet to be, in fact, the Messiah. Within Christian tradition, there is a long history of that. And to live in the kingdom, what's the greatest commandment according to Jesus? Love God, love your neighbors yourself. Okay, how do we do that? The best way, the most effective way, a good way to do that is to treat each person as if they are Christ himself. There's a long tradition within the monastic, particularly Benedictine story about treating each person as if that person is Christ. Man, woman, young, old, rich, poor, makes no difference. Is that God incarnate right in front of me? Because if so, you're likely to treat them differently if, rather than it's just the guy who's trying to get your drink order right, or the woman who's done something wrong and you're very annoyed for the 10th time, or the person who adjusted the thermostats in the church and made it 95 degrees. I'm trying really hard to see Jesus in them, but I can't at the moment. When you get in there, you'll know what I'm talking about. That constant theme is what Aaron and I have been talking about all this time. What does it mean to live in the kingdom? You can look at it from a Christian or Jewish perspective. Is Tom the Messiah? Let's not ask Bonnie, his wife, but is Tom the Messiah? Clearly not, according to him. Very good, humble answer. For the rest of us, do we still treat him as the Messiah? Yes. What about you and you? Do you think of yourself as the Messiah, not to save the world, but how you're called to act with other people? And how do I interact? If I see Jesus in you, do we treat differently? That's what it means to live in the kingdom.
There is a rabbinic legend that suggests that at any given time in the world, there are 36 righteous individuals. They're called Lamed Vav Nikim. Lamed Vav are the two Hebrew letters that spell 36. So a Lamed Vav Nik is one who is one of those 36. At any given time in the world, there are 36 righteous individuals upon whom the world is sustained, or for whose benefit, or on whose account the world is sustained, but their identity is unknown even to them. That's the idea. Therefore, indeed, not only could the next person you meet be one of these individuals, the Messiah, God, what have you, but you could be. Now what's expected, right? This is sort of taking the parable of the unjust judge and the widow, and what if we're the widow? What if we're the judge, right? What if you're the one that the world's waiting for? Sort of fascinating.
Comments, questions? Mike.
Yeah, we've been talking about the story as if the point were the responsible use of money, and indeed it is. But I'm struck by the fact that this has certainly been a proof text for the notion that there are two places, two ultimate destinations, heaven and hell. And Christ seems to think that that is the motivation hear particularly Rabbi Bisno's notion of what damnation means in the Jewish tradition and what you think it means in the Christian tradition.
Summarize that.
Well, one of the things that John and I talked about was a need to solicit topics for the class as it goes forward beyond just these initial parables. So your question is simply too large to deal with just now in the time that we have. The notion of damnation or repentance or virtue or reward, all that whole system, but it's definitely worth our time. I'm happy to hang out a little bit afterwards and begin to do it some justice, but I think it deserves more time than...
Michael used the term proof text. That means I already believe X, so I will go into the Bible to find passages to prove through those texts what I already believe. All Jews are terrible. Aha, look, it says this right here. All priests are bad, says that right here. I'm really good, says that right there. Whatever you want to prove, it's pretty easy to do using the scriptures. The story is, again, probably not about a nuanced version of what we would call heaven and hell. Those are not clearly defined categories in the Bible in any way like we tend to think of them in popular culture. It mentions Sheol, the Hebrew term, Hades is a Greek term, is kind of an intermediary place, but heaven and hell are different categories. And it depends on what book of the Bible you're talking about. Because this book, Luke, was written between 75 and 80 after Jesus died, AD, or Common Era, somewhere in there. And the earliest Hebrew books are written, Genesis.
400 BC.
400 BC. So there's 500, 600 years approximately in some of these, the depth. So not everybody agrees. Think of what Americans thought 25 years ago compared to today. So this is a long stretch over lots of authors in that tradition. So the idea of heaven and hell, damnation, how do you get saved, is a much later idea that we read back into it oftentimes. Great question, Michael. What other? We got 3 to 5 minutes. Next time we're going to, so think about it now. This class ends December 18th. What would you like to talk about subject-wise the next semester? There are a lot of ideas we have, but think about that for next time. You had a question, comment, Russ?
Some recent Christian scholarship from the Eastern tradition that claims that until almost the Middle Ages, the consensus notion across Christian teachers and writers was that everybody would get saved in the next life sooner or later. There was no permanent hell. That's actually a fairly recent development, and of course we owe our own image to Dante, one of the greatest poets ever. I think we try not to read it too literally, but it took a long time among Christian believers for that idea to coalesce, and it's now being argued that it is not at all biblical.
Fascinating. So the evolution of the thought about eschatology, about heaven, hell, afterlife, in Judaism we call it olam haba, the world to come. Right? These are all coalescing. Even in this story, it seems that to read it on its face, remember we talked about the different levels at which any text can be read, but on its face it seems that the rich man is condemned because he was rich, and the poor man is rewarded simply because of his poverty. We've ascribed to each of them various characteristics, but even as bad as the rich man is in the description, it's juxtaposed against Lazarus. Eternal damnation is a lot, right? So, I mean, these ideas are evolving over time, and we're still grappling with them, right?
Here's a really interesting point. Did the Pharisees themselves believe in resurrection? Yeah, they did. Not necessarily how we talk about it, but some type of general resurrection at the end of time, which, by the way, is probably the most... I hope you don't get upset about this tonight. Does the Bible talk about when you die, what happens? Do you go to heaven? Your soul go to heaven? It's not really that clear, is it? we, some sense, fall asleep in God, and then we all wake up at a general resurrection. It's not at all what pop culture or what the average person thinks. You die, you get into heaven. That's not scriptural. We'll leave it there and resume next week. Come back with more questions next week.